video we're going to talk about saving the correct seed, and there's a lot of different varieties of seed out there and you have to be a little bit careful about which ones you're choosing to grow and save. By choosing heritage varieties, you know that you're getting varieties that have been long grown, and you're going to be encouraging some of those vegetable and fruit varieties that we're going to lose otherwise. We've developed a very broad, interesting array of different vegetables over the years, and by sticking with a certain few that have had their genetics tampered with by a company of some kind, we're actually limiting the amount of those interesting and nutritious vegetables that we can carry on into the future for future generations. So that's where heritage varieties come into importance. Open pollinated means they haven't had a limit on the range of pollen that has fertilized and basically entered their genetics into the seed that you're saving. So you want to make sure that you have a good array of genetics in your seed, because that means you're going to have a healthy and resilient plant in the next generation once you grow the plant from the seed. For something like a tomato, for example, you want to make sure that the fruit itself is ripe, because an unripe fruit is going to have unripe seed, and if the seed haven't developed fully, then they're not going to germinate once you've saved them. So there are a few ways to tell whether your seed are viable or not before you save them, which is a very handy tip, and I'll come back to that. In the first instance, you want to make sure that if you're picking a fruit off a tomato plant, you're not going for the unripe one, green still. This one here is a little bit funky looking. You've got holes in it and it's warped and kind of small. What you want to do is you want to choose a healthy plant and a healthy fruit. So this is a good example. It's a nice shiny, plump, full looking tomato. Definitely good seed, viable inside. So we're going to look at how we process those in a future video. As far as plant health goes, you want to make sure that if you're collecting seed from your garden, you want to try and grow at least a couple of plants of that type. If you're just growing the one, you're relying on other people within a bee's flight or a wind blow for that pollen to come across and for you to get that genetic diversity. So ideally you're going to have healthier seed if you have multiple plants of that type. So for example, for the tomatoes, I've got 2 or 3 of the tomato plants of that variety, and that way I know that there's at least going to be some kind of genetic diversity still maintained in the seed that I'm saving. I should mention that this tomato is a Tommy Toe tomato, so it's actually quite a small variety that I like to grow, and it's a heritage variety. But just so you have the reference, if this was the size of a larger variety of tomato that you're growing, that's probably not going to be one of the fruits that you're saving the seed from, because it's undersized and the seeds are probably going to be a little bit dodgy. So keep that in mind. So in a not wet fruit, this is related to rocket, but it's a wasabi leaf. So it's a brassica family. So it's related to cabbage, broccoli, and they all have a relatively similar way of saving seed and telling whether the seed is ready to go. So you can see here that it hasn't been flowering quite as long as it should for seed collection yet. So you've got flowers at the top, these have been pollinated, and you've got the seeds starting to develop in these pods here. The further you go down, the longer it's been since that flower was pollinated. And you can see down here, these have lumps along them. You can sort of see the seeds forming inside. Now, once they're ready to go, those pods are going to start browning off and looking a bit dry. If you leave them too long after that dry point, they're going to drop to the soil and self-seed anyway, which is good. But if you want to save the seed and store them for somebody else, you need to make sure that you're not picking these too early. And once they're dry, you can just basically get a container underneath and break them into that. So it's also worth talking about where you probably shouldn't be saving your seed from. If you are buying vegetables from the supermarket, for example, the likelihood is that a lot of those seed are going to be from sources that you don't really want to be propagating. So definitely not heritage varieties for the most part. A good example is pumpkins. So pumpkins all have a similar heritage, so they come from the same plant. So over the years they've been bred to have different types of fruit, different types of pumpkin. By having the same heritage, it means that they can cross-pollinate between the varieties. So when you're buying a pumpkin from somewhere, you need to keep in mind that out at the farm where that's come from, they've probably been growing several varieties of pumpkin at the same time, and that might mean you get an interesting or strange hybridized variety coming out of the seed when you germinate them next. And that means you're not going to know what kind of fruit it's going to develop once it grows, and there is a possibility that if it's a certain kind of hybrid, it's not going to make a very nice fruit at all, which is going to be a bit of a bummer for people if they get seed from the seed library and then grow a pumpkin and it turns out to be a cardboard orange horror. So you keep that in mind too. Now, it's also worth noting that there are other vegetables that have similar heritage. They come from the same plant and they've been selected apart in qualities. So if they're the same species, that usually means they can pollinate each other. And so things like broccoli and broccoletti, for example, they come from the same plant. And so if you want to grow a big fat broccoli and it's been pollinated by bees that have visited a broccoletti, you grow seed from that plant and it's going to be something between a broccoli and a broccoletti. So it's going to be like a moderately long, stretchy broccoli instead of the big lump that you usually are expecting. Or if you're looking for broccoletti, like the nice little flower heads, it's going to be a little bit more squat than that. In this case, it's probably still going to be quite edible, but it's worth keeping in mind because you want to make sure that if you're labeling a seed something for the seed library, you want to make sure that it's going to grow what you said it's going to grow. Otherwise, people are going to be a little bit dismayed by it. So the same sort of thing can happen with tomatoes. It's another good example. Cherry tomatoes are not the same species of tomato as a lot of the other varieties of tomato. And with your tomatoes and the cross-pollinating side of things, or any of the vegetables that you know are going to cross-pollinate and potentially hybridize, it's usually a good way to go to pick one that you like the best, grow that as the only one of its type in your garden, and then you can trade that product with other people that are growing other varieties, and that gives you a bit of tradability. The other thing you can do is you can try and stagger the flowering times. So if you have two kinds of pumpkin growing at the same time in your garden, you want to make sure that you pull all the flowers off one variety and let the other one flower and fruit. And then once the flowers are finished on the other one, you can let the second one fruit. And that way they're not actually going to be allowed to pollinate each other. It's only when both of the flowers are open at the same time on different plants that they're able to cross-pollinate. So you can control it in that fashion as well. So I hope you've learned something about saving the right seeds, because in the next video, we're going to be learning about how to prepare those seeds correctly for storage.